Thank you, Herb. The passage that Herb just read for us describes what is the low point, and I really mean the lowest of lows in the history of ancient Israel. It discusses the destruction, the complete annihilation, really, of the kingdom of Judah and its capital, Jerusalem. And it's really hard to overstate just how significant of an event this was, not only for the people who went through it, but for the story of the Bible as a whole. Now, before I get any further into this, I do feel compelled to acknowledge that some of you have been doing the daily biblical readings very faithfully, and you might notice that we have not quite come to this passage yet in our daily readings. Perhaps you could tell it was coming from the dire warnings of the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but no, we haven't quite read this yet. And the reason I skipped ahead is not because I think what Jeremiah and Ezekiel have to say is unimportant. On the contrary, I'll actually make reference to it before the sermon's over, but because this event was just so influential for the way that we understand the meaning of the people of God. Because this wasn't just a painful event, it was a redefining one. It forced the people who went through it to say, hang on a second, this wasn't supposed to happen. So what did we miss here? What does it mean to be the people of God anyway? And I would argue that some of the thinking that they did, the ways that they reinterpreted God's promises and the hope that we have in God, made Christianity as a religion and an outgrowth of the Jewish faith possible. Something that may not have ever happened were it not for this tragic experience. And so with this in mind, I felt that it was just too much to try to cover this weighty event in 1 week. We're going to be discussing it both this week and next week. This week, just going to be asking the question, what happened and what does this mean in light of the larger story? And when I say the larger story, I don't just mean Judah's history. I mean the story of the Bible, the story that starts with the creation of the universe and ends with the consummation of all things, the big story. This event, the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile of the people, was a significant transition in that story. The fall of Jerusalem is the event that brings Act 3 of our 7-act play to a conclusion and launches us into Act 4, the exile, a new relationship between God and the chosen people. Now, I know that I'm using these literary terms and talking about history, but I don't want you to think that this is just a book report or a historical study, because these things that we're discussing here have a very significant impact on how we understand ourselves as God's people today, especially when we look around us and things don't seem to be happening in the way that we think they should be happening. That being said, there's a danger in over-intellectualizing this event. For the people who went through it, it wasn't a fascinating event. It was a deeply traumatic experience. I mean, their entire world, all of the anchors of their identity and their community were suddenly uprooted in one fell swoop. And the people respond to this. And we have many of those responses preserved in our canon, from laments, lamentations, people just expressing grief, not only in the book of Lamentations, but even in the Psalms and some of the prophets, to expressions of anger, calls for vengeance against the oppressors who would do this to them, and even against the people who just stood by and watched as it happened. And expressions of bewilderment as people wondered how their God could let this happen, and even questioned whether God was supporting them at all. I think it's important that we engage these things, and the entire focus of next week's message will be on engaging the experience of the people who went through this and thinking about how we respond to such things. But first, I want to get the basic facts straight and consider what really happened here and how do we understand it. And to do this, we need to review what we've discussed so far in this series from a big picture perspective of the story of the Bible as a whole. Now, you may recall that the story of the Bible, as we've been describing it, is a love story between three main characters: God, the world, and the people of God. And in the first act of this story, which we call the backstory, God creates the world as something that is beautiful and perfectly in balance and harmonious and good, but in a way that still stretches into mystery that's hard, if not impossible, for us to understand. Evil somehow got into that world, and it messed things up. It not only tainted God's perfect creation, but infected it. And we find that evil spreads from humans to human societies, even to animals and the land itself, until this beautiful world that God created was becoming something else, something much more broken and painful and out of line with God's original intention. And to make matters worse, one of the effects of this evil was that it made it hard for humans to even be able to hear the voice of God or know what it was that God wanted from them. And so God's attempts to just speak to people and fix things seemed to be thwarted. What was God going to do in response to this challenge? Well, as early as Act 2, we begin to learn the basics of God's plan to try to save the human race and the rest of creation. And that is through the calling of a chosen people. As we see, God starts with two individuals, Abraham and Sarah, and calls on them to be the founders of a different kind of people, a set-apart nation. And in this set-apart nation, they would only worship God. They would get their direction from God alone, and they would rely on God and not any of the resources of the world as their strength and their protection. And they would make God's will the very law of their land, the way that they operated as a community. Now, this is a lofty idea, one that was intended not only to bless them, but to bless the peoples of the world. But it was by no means easy. The people struggled. It took centuries for them to even be able to develop a basic understanding of who God was and what God wanted from them. And these centuries came with extraordinarily painful experiences. At one point, the people of Israel came down to Egypt, where they were enslaved, and they spent hundreds of years in slavery. And then God led them out of slavery miraculously through the Red Sea, only to have them end up in the wilderness where they wandered for 40 years. But finally, after this period of wandering, they make their way into this promised land, this land of milk and honey, where God really is going to develop them. And yet they are so ununited, so disorganized and unclear about who God is, that they can't even form the basics of a nation, let alone a great nation that's supposed to save the world. And so at the beginning of Act 3, the people of God come with a proposal. They wanted to form a kingdom, literally a nation that was led by a king. They came to God and said, look, this whole chosen people thing, it's not working out. We really feel like we need someone that we can look to, that we can see, who can inspire us and guide us and protect us. We want you to give us a king. And God responds by saying, this is a bad idea. You don't want to have a king. This is what makes the nations around you suffer. I'm trying to call you to be a separate people, and you want to put yourself under the authority of these flawed, power-hungry leaders. And the people said, well, we're not trying to go away from being your chosen people. We're not letting go of that. We'll let you anoint the leaders, but we really need a king. So God agrees. God goes along with this proposal that the people had brought. And God does anoint kings for them. First, Saul, whom gets a really bad rep in our Christian communities, but honestly was a pretty impressive person, at least at the beginning of his reign. Just not good enough to be the leader of God's holy nation. And then God anoints David to be the king. And David, though deeply flawed, proves to be an individual who just loves God with all of his heart and is constantly thinking about God and everything that he does, and who turns to God truly as the source of his strength before making decisions in response to victories that happen. And God says, you know, this is something I can work with. If the people are able to live under a leader like David, maybe we can make this kingdom work. And so God enters into a covenant with David, one that ends up being one of the most significant sources of identity for the people of Israel. And this is so important that I want to look again at this conversation that occurred between David and God way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 to consider the different aspects of this. So the first component of it was the land itself, right? Like God promised that the people would be able to live in the land of Israel if they were able to remain under good leadership, saying to David, I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they may live in their own place and be disturbed no more. Now, that might not seem that significant to us. Why does the land of Israel matter? But remember, these people had been nomads. They had been refugees. They understood how valuable it was to have a stable place in order to develop as a society at all. And so the very fact that they were able to form a nation in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, which itself was sandwiched between the most powerful empires in the world at that point in history, was a sign that God was blessing them. And as long as they were in that land, they knew that God had not given up on this promise to David. Now, the second part of this promise spoke not only of the land, but also as a means of connecting with God, the temple of Yahweh. Now, this is interesting to me how this is mentioned so early on. I mean, as soon as David is anointed, before he even has a thought of Solomon being his son, God says this to him. When your days are fulfilled, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now, a house for my name is another one of those phrases that we can read past quickly, but this was so significant. This is the idea that God would dwell among them in a way that could be found, in a way that could be recognized, in a way that legitimized their status as the people of God. Now, we might wonder, now, hang on a second, what does that mean for God to have a house and dwell among them? Surely they didn't believe that God was literally living there, right? Well, no. But the language that this passage uses is that my name will be there. The place where I am most clearly recognized. The place where I can be called upon. In fact, the place not only for you, but for all of the peoples of the earth when they want to come to God will be in this temple in Jerusalem. And so the temple becomes another one of the pillars of this covenant with David. And then, as you can already see from the passage that we just read, there's a third component to this, and that has to do with David himself and his descendants. If we go back to that passage again, we can see that it says, I will establish the throne of his, meaning David's, kingdom forever. Now that's a pretty bold promise. God is so pleased with David that God makes this promise that David or one of his descendants would rule forever. And if you think, well, maybe that's just kind of hyperbole, the way that it happens to be talking in this verse. No, the same point is made again, just a few verses later. As you can see here in verse 16, God says directly to David, your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. Now, I don't know about you, but this sounds pretty unconditional to me. That God was so pleased with David that whatever happened from here on out, God was committed to keeping one of David's descendants on the throne. Now, the reason that I wanted to review these promises that we've already discussed in this series is so we can appreciate just how devastating this conquest and destruction of Jerusalem was. It wasn't just that they went through these terrible losses, that they lost their country, they lost their land, they lost their leader. But each of these losses reflected on a promise that God had made to them. And so it felt like God had betrayed them. Or maybe their faith was fundamentally incorrect. I want to think about this. Each part of this Davidic covenant was undone, was undermined by the Babylonians. So regarding the land of Israel, you see that the people were actually exiled from the land. The Babylonians had taken a chapter from the Assyrians on this point. The Assyrians were the rulers, the great empire before them. They tried to dominate the peoples of the world by forcing them to live away from their homeland, separating them out through all these scattered cities and communities. And after the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, well, they did the same thing. They took the population of the people of Judah, uprooted them, and spread them out all throughout the empire. That meant they were no longer in the land that God had promised them. And for many people, this meant that they no longer had God's blessing and protection. And if this wasn't enough, then we see not only that they were taken from the land, but their temple was utterly destroyed. It wasn't just that they had had the temple desecrated. This had actually happened several times before. There had been other conquerors who had come through and raided the temple and taken some of the precious items out of it back with them. There had been bad kings, such as Ahaz and Manasseh, who had gone into the Holy of Holies and put pagan idols or objects of worship there. But as long as the temple was still standing, it was a symbol of hope that connection with God could always be rekindled. That if the people turned to that temple and prayed in the place where God's name dwelt, they could know that God would hear them. So the Babylonians didn't just raid the temple, they utterly destroyed it. Not only did they take out the gold and silver objects, but they melted them down so that they were no longer recognizable. As far as the objects of lesser value go, they took the bronze pieces, including the water basin that the priests used to wash their hands, and broke them, crushed them to pieces in the watching of all those who were there. And then they set what remained on fire. Remember, this temple was filled with these beautifully made curtains that were embroidered by masters of their trade, that were made to very specific instructions. And all of this went up in flames as the walls of the temple were torn down, and the people saw that their connection point to God was taken away. And finally, regarding the dynasty of David himself, this too was taken away from them. It was brought sharply to an end. Because what happens is that King Nebuchadnezzar, after capturing the sitting king of Judah, King Zedekiah, takes all of his sons, all of the potential legitimate heirs to the throne, and kills them in front of his eyes, and then makes Zedekiah a slave so that he could have no more children. And in case there were any more questions about this, they take a governor from the land of Judah, or from the land of Babylon, and put them in charge of the region that had formerly been Judah. How could God's promise that a descendant of David would sit on the throne forever continue to be true if there wasn't even a throne in Judah anymore? So as you can imagine, this was a pretty big blow, right? This fundamentally rocked the way that people understood their relationship to God. And you might wonder, well, okay, how did they recover from this? How does the story go on? Well, the reality is that there were probably a lot of people who never did recover. I mean, this was just a devastating experience. And as the people were scattered into these Babylonian cities where they were allowed to rebuild their lives with new Babylonian names, I'm sure that some of them said, you know what, this Yahweh thing, it's not working. It hurts too much. I am just going to go with what seems the most comfortable. But there were still many people who, despite this tragic event, held on to the faith. And I would say that of those who did, they responded to it in one of two ways. Now, there was one camp of people who just stubbornly refused to believe that despite everything that happened, that God had actually broken or given up on any of these promises. No, they still believed that they could come back from this. So take the land, for example, right? It looks like God had abandoned the land, that the people of Israel were no longer in the land. But there were some folks, including perhaps the author of 2 Kings, who wanted to emphasize that no, it hadn't been abandoned completely. So in this line that you see from 2 Kings, it's important that they include the detail. The captain of the guard left some of the poorest people of the land to be vine dressers and tillers of the soil. And as long as some people were still there, God could bless them. The prophet Zephaniah seizes on this when he says, "For I will leave in the midst of you a people humble and lowly. They shall seek refuge in the name of the Lord, the remnant of Israel." So no, they said, God has not abandoned the people from the land, and eventually God will bring the rest of the people back, and we will see that this has remained intact. Likewise, those same folks argued that yes, the temple had been destroyed, but the temple could be rebuilt. It wasn't a matter of the physical items that were in the temple, the curtains or the holy objects or any of those things. Really, what mattered is that it was on Mount Zion and that it followed the instructions that God could make. So if the people could get possession of Mount Zion again, they could build a new temple as if nothing had ever gone wrong. To their credit, that is what happens, at least for a while. We'll find out later in this story that the people do make their way back from Jerusalem, and the temple is indeed rebuilt, a temple that plays a significant role in the New Testament. And now the Davidic dynasty, you might be wondering, okay, how do they recover from this one, right? Like Zedekiah, the last king, and all of his descendants had been killed. But you have to remember that the line of David through a different route was actually still alive. Because before Zedekiah became king, there was a previous king named Jehoiachin, whom Nebuchadnezzar had captured and made a prisoner in Jerusalem, but kept alive. And the author of 2 Kings makes a strategic decision to end his narrative by including this detail about Jehoiachin. So he says, so in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin of Judah, King evil Merodach of Babylon, so that's Nebuchadnezzar's successor, in the year that he began to reign, released King Jehoiachin of Judah from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above all the other seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. And the implication is that Jehoiachin was able to live on and have children. And if he had children and they had children, and this went on and on for generations, it was just possible that one of those direct descendants of Jehoiachin, who was also a direct descendant of David, could reclaim the throne. And the promise thus would not have been lost. Now, these ideas were pretty popular and widespread among the community that held on to the faith. But at the same time, there was another camp, another line of interpretation that was so affected by these events that they thought, you know what, we have to reconsider what it was God was saying and making these promises to David. So, regarding the land of Israel, one of the key figures in this is the prophet Jeremiah, who, before the temple had been destroyed, was writing to Jehoiachin, the captured king, and the others who were in Babylon, and who says this: "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I've sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into its exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare." What's striking about this is that it suggests that God could bless the people in another place. That even if they weren't in their homeland, they should function for the welfare of whatever city that they found themselves in. And God could make them the people of God even there. Now, this is not to say that Jeremiah had given up on the idea of returning to the actual land of Israel. No, he actually talks about this just a few verses later. But this plants a seed of thinking a little bit more broadly of what it means to be the people of God, and whether that requires identifying in a particular place. Likewise, the prophet Ezekiel, who is also writing before this happens, has a bizarre vision at the beginning of the book of Israel, at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, a vision that is enough to scare a lot of people off from actually reading the book, if we're being honest. Here you have this bizarre fiery wheel thing that comes out into the sky, and it's got these like mystical creatures flying around it with a throne of God sitting on top. But what it seems to represent is the Spirit of God, and Ezekiel watches as it leaves the temple before it had been destroyed. And this might seem discouraging. It might seem like abandonment. It was actually quite hopeful. Suggested that God could travel, that there could be other connecting points between God. And so the key line I would say in this section to help us understand it is that wherever the Spirit would go, they went. And the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. The idea here is that, yes, you do need to have some kind of connecting point to be able to understand God and pray to God effectively and meaningfully. But maybe it's not locked into one place. Maybe the Spirit of God can move. Again, this is an idea that doesn't mean they'd abandoned the hope of rebuilding the temple. In fact, Ezekiel himself has a vision of the temple being restored at the end of the book. But it lays the foundation for the book of Acts and the hope that the Spirit of God can in fact travel. And then eventually, much later in the story, people even begin to rethink the meaning of David's throne itself. Yes, God had promised that there would be a descendant of David who always sat on that throne and reigned forever. But that reign might not necessarily look like we typically think a king's reign does. Consider these words from the prophet Zechariah. Rejoice, O daughter Zion. Shout aloud. Lo, your king comes to you. Triumphant and victorious is he. Humble and riding on a donkey. He will cut off the chariot from Ephraim and the war horse from Jerusalem. And the battle bow shall be cut off. And he shall command peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. So here you have an even broader view of what kind of authority the anointed one of God, the Messiah, would have. But it's a view that doesn't involve any of the traditional weapons of war. No chariots, no war horse, no battle bows. Somehow this ruler would rule without violence. And that also becomes a significant point in the New Testament. Now, again, I want to emphasize that these were not clear ideas by any means. It was just a kind of new, broader type of thinking that this tragic situation forced the people to undergo. And it might be worth noting that we're still often in need of this kind of thinking. You see, it's in our human nature to think of God narrowly. We have these real, powerful, transformative experiences with God. And then we want to say, oh yeah, we know really who God is and what God is like. And we have an idea of what God is all about. When in reality, we probably only understand a piece of it. And so we tend to think about God and talk about God in relation to our experiences and our world and our institutions, right? God is acting through our church. This is what God is doing in our country. This is what we can see. But sometimes we see that these institutions are threatened. We wonder what happens when a church starts dying, or when America finds that people are disappearing in terms of their commitment to the faith, or perhaps when the institutions of a government like the United States itself start to fail. And we wonder, what does this mean? Does this mean God is losing? Does this mean things aren't panning out? It might just mean that God's work is broader than we think. Oftentimes it takes these scary revelations for us to begin to see that God may be doing something bigger than any of us can picture. It doesn't nullify our real experiences or the promises that God has made for us, but it forces us to be a bit humble and open to the fact that it's not ultimately about us. Only God knows where all of this is heading. Now, none of this is particularly reassuring for the people who have gone through these experiences of loss. And so I don't mean to offer this as comfort. I don't mean to negate the very real pain that either the ancient people of Judah or people today experience when the world around them crumbles. But I hope that we can keep it in mind. I hope that we can be the kind of people that when we experience suffering, or when things don't go the way that we think they should, when God doesn't act the way we think that God should, that we're able to step back and think, maybe there's more to this picture than I understand. And let God expand our understanding to even greater revelation and insight. Amen.